At 23 years old, Carson McCullers wrote one of the greatest American novels, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. But behind that literary genius was a life of unrelenting tragedy. Nearly her entire existence was a long, drawn-out battle against devastating illness. A series of strokes attacked her, leaving her severely paralyzed until, finally, she had to type her works using only a single finger. She was an extraordinary mind trapped in a disintegrating body. Her tragedy wasn't just physical. Her confidant, her twin soul, was Truman Capote. Both were dreamy Southern prodigies. But while Capote chose the spotlight and turned scandal into an art form, Carson craved only one thing: to be loved. And she spent her entire life in unrequited love with people who would never love her back. In the end, even Capote betrayed her, mocking her after she had fallen. This is the story of the girl who dreamed like Capote, but died in silence at 50, nearly forgotten. The key to unlocking Carson McCullers, to truly understanding her obsession with isolation, with freaks, and her longing to belong, is the place that forged her. The South was not just where she was born, it was what she was molded from. And that furnace was Columbus, Georgia, February 19th, 1917. This was not the romantic, magnolia-scented South of Gone with the Wind. This was the real South, a South still bearing the deep, unhealed scars of the Civil War and Reconstruction. A South caught in the grip of the Great Depression, where poverty wasn't a possibility, but a daily reality. Columbus, like many Southern mill towns of the era, was a suffocating place, not just from the humid Georgia summer heat, but from the social atmosphere. It was a world built on conformity. Everything had its order, the rigid racial rules of Jim Crow that strictly divided black and white, the rigid gender rules that dictated how men must be and how women must behave, and the rigid religious rules of the Bible Belt that policed all conduct. In such a world, anyone who deviated from the norm, whether physically, emotionally, or intellectually, wasn't just seen as different. They were seen as a freak, and it was this grotesque that became the foundation of the literary genre Carson would come to master: Southern Gothic. Unlike European Gothic, with its ancient castles and ghosts, Southern Gothic found its horror next door. It was in the once great families now in decay, in the secrets buried in rotting houses, in the repressed desires that exploded into violence, and in the freak characters who lived on the edge of town: the giants, the dwarves, the fanatical preachers, the lonely. Writers like William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor explored this. As Flannery O'Connor liked to say, Southern writers recognize freaks because they still live close enough to see them, and for the hard of hearing, you have to shout. This environment was a pressure cooker for a sensitive soul. It forced a choice: conform, be crushed, or develop an inner life so rich it becomes its own world, a sanctuary. Carson, from a very young age, chose the sanctuary. Her birth name was Lula Carson Smith. From the beginning, she was a contradiction. Her father, Lamar Smith, was a jeweler and watchmaker. He was a quiet, gentle, loving man who passed on to his daughter a love for intricate details and the slow passing of time. He was her safe harbor. Her mother, Marguerite Waters Smith, was the opposite. She was a woman of immense, stifled ambition. Trapped in the role of a small-town housewife, she poured all her hopes, dreams, and frustrations into her firstborn daughter. Marguerite was convinced that Lula Carson wasn't just special. She believed her child was a genius. This combination, a contemplative father and a driving mother, created an intense internal pressure, but it was the world outside that truly formed her. Lula Carson was not like the other girls. While they played with dolls and practiced their charms, she was off by herself reading. She was awkwardly tall, rail-thin, and clumsy, and as she entered her teens, she made a rebellious declaration. She chopped off her long hair into a boyish bob and began wearing trousers, or overalls. In the context of 1930s Columbus, Georgia, this was not a fashion choice. It was an act of social defiance. She was instantly branded a freak. She was teased, ostracized. She had become one of her own characters before she ever wrote them. She was Mick Kelly from The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, the dreamy tomboy who longed for music and beauty in a world that only saw grit. She was Frankie Adams from The Member of the Wedding, the tall, awkward 12-year-old so desperate to belong to something, anything, that she wanted to join her brother's wedding. This isolation wasn't just social, it was about to become a brutal physical reality. And here is the tragic, fateful event that shaped the rest of her life. When she was around 13 or 14, Carson fell gravely ill. She suffered high fevers, agonizing joint pain, and crushing fatigue. Today we know these are the classic symptoms of rheumatic fever. Had it been properly diagnosed and treated with antibiotics, penicillin was not yet widely available. It could have been managed. But in 1930s Georgia, the doctors misdiagnosed it. They called it growing pains. They called it neurasthenia, a vague catch-all for anything male-dominated medicine didn't understand about women. They were catastrophically wrong. The untreated rheumatic fever didn't go away. It silently attacked her body. It settled in her joints, causing arthritis. And most importantly, it attacked her heart. The bacteria permanently damaged her heart valves, scarring them. Her body at 14 became a time bomb. That damaged heart would struggle to pump blood for the rest of her life. It would lead to the formation of blood clots, and those clots would eventually travel to her brain, causing a series of devastating strokes that would rob her of everything, except her talent. The suffocating atmosphere of the South gave her a theme, but this misdiagnosed illness gave her an urgency. It instilled in her a subconscious awareness that time was not infinite. It gave her a deep, innate empathy for physical pain, for the feeling of being trapped inside a body that would not obey. And it gave her one single, all-consuming need. She had to get out. The escape plan at first wasn't words, it was music. At her mother Marguerite's insistence, Carson was groomed as a musical prodigy. She began piano lessons at a young age and showed an extraordinary talent. Music was her first language, one that transcended her social awkwardness and isolation. When she sat at the piano, she wasn't the freak Lula Carson. She was an artist. The piano became her obsession and her one-way ticket out of Columbus. Marguerite had a grand plan. Her daughter would go to New York City and attend the prestigious Juilliard School. She would become a great concert pianist. Imagine the hope placed on this young woman's shoulders. In 1934, at 17, Carson Smith boarded a train heading north. She carried her mother's ambitions, her own fears, and the carefully saved money for her Juilliard tuition. And this is where fate intervened with an almost cinematic cruelty. The story has become part of the McCullers legend. Upon arriving in New York, she lost the money. Some versions say she left her wallet on the subway. Others suggest it was stolen. Some skeptical biographers have even suggested she may have invented the story, that she was so terrified by the prospect of actually having to audition at Juilliard, so afraid of failure, that she self-sabotaged. The precise truth doesn't matter as much as the result. The money was gone. The Juilliard dream was dead on arrival. She couldn't bear the shame of calling home to confess her failure. So she stayed in New York, a 17-year-old alone and penniless, in the depths of the Great Depression. She did what she had to do to survive. She worked as a waitress. She worked as a typist. She found a job playing piano in a dingy Greenwich Village bar, playing popular tunes for drunk patrons, a painful contrast to the concert halls she had dreamed of. She was living on the margins, observing the other lost souls of the city, and in that desperation she found her true salvation. To fill her time and find a direction, she enrolled in nighttime creative writing classes at Columbia University. It was here she met her first crucial mentor, Whit Burnett. Burnett was a key figure in the literary world. He was the editor of Story magazine, a prestigious publication that had discovered talents like J.D. Salinger and William Saroyan. Burnett wasn't looking for polished, pretty prose. He was looking for truth, a unique, unadulterated voice. And he found it in the tall, gangly, serious young woman from Georgia. Carson gave him her first manuscripts. They were strange, melancholy, and undeniably powerful. Burnett immediately recognized the raw, primal talent. He saw a writer who didn't just describe loneliness, but who wrote from inside it. He encouraged her. He told her that her voice mattered. For the first time, Carson realized that all those years of feeling like a freak, all the pain, the isolation, and the silent observations weren't a curse. They were her greatest asset. She realized she could do with words what she had never quite been able to do with music. She could compose symphonies of emotion, using different characters as instruments, each playing their own lonely melody, yet blending together in a complex counterpoint. The concert pianist was dead, but Carson McCullers, the writer, was born from the ashes. It was also during this chaotic time in New York that she met the man who would become both her greatest love and her greatest tragedy, the man who would give her the name the world would come to know. His name was James Reeves McCullers, Jr. He was a handsome, charming young corporal from Alabama, and like her, he was an outsider. Reeves also had literary ambitions, a sensitive soul, and a sense of not quite belonging in the world. They recognized each other instantly. They were two Southern freaks, lost in the North. They saw in each other an understanding that no one else could provide. Their connection was intense, almost immediate. They talked for hours about books, about their dreams, about feeling trapped. For Carson, who had always longed for a we to belong to, Reeves seemed to be the answer. In 1937, when she was 20, they married. She became Carson McCullers. Their marriage, like everything in her life, was intensely complicated from the start. It was a union of genuine love, codependency, conflicting professional ambitions, and an unspoken understanding of each other's complex desires. Carson, even then, was drawn powerfully to women, a fact that Reeves seemed to accept or at least tolerate. They were a brilliant, combustible, glorious mess. Reeves encouraged her to write. He believed in her genius, perhaps even more than she did at the time. They moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where Reeves had found work. And it was there, in a small apartment at 22 years old, that Carson McCullers sat down and began to write the novel that would change literary history. She took everything: the loneliness of Georgia, the feeling of being a freak, the broken dream of music, the observations of lost souls in New York, and her own desperate yearning for connection, and she poured it all onto the page. She was writing The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. The novel that 22-year-old Carson McCullers began writing in that small North Carolina apartment wasn't just a book. It was an act of exorcism. It was her indictment of the South that had shaped her, her cry of loneliness for the isolation that had plagued her, and her symphony for all the other lost souls she had observed in her short life. At first, she called it The Mute, a simple, direct title. But as she wrote, it evolved into something far more complex and profound. She worked with a steely discipline, an almost manic focus. Reeves would go to work and she would sit at her table, often still in her pajamas, and enter the inner world of her fictional Georgia town. She wrote for hours, typing steadily, stopping only to smoke, a lifelong habit, and drink coffee. This was not an easily written text. She wrestled with it. She wrote and rewrote, searching for the perfect structure. She knew she didn't just want to tell a story, she wanted to create a feeling. And then she found it, not in prose, but in music. The memory of her years of piano practice, of the complex fugues of Bach, gave her the structure. A fugue is a contrapuntal composition where multiple independent voices, melodies, are woven together, each telling its own story, yet all combining to form a harmonious and complex whole. Carson realized, this is how to write my book. She would have not just one protagonist, she would have an ensemble of souls. She wove a tapestry of distinct voices, each telling its own story of loneliness, all revolving around a silent center. The first voice, and the most autobiographical, was Mick Kelly. Mick is a 12-year-old tomboy, tall and awkward, who longs for music and beauty in a world of poverty and grit. She is the book's yearning heart, Carson as a young girl, desperate for a language to express her inner room. Then, she created the voice of intellect and rage, Dr. Benedict Mady Copeland. He is the town's only black doctor, a man educated in the North, who carries a burning fury against racial injustice, yet is painfully isolated from his own community by his rigid idealism. Beside him was political rage, embodied in Jake Blount. He is a radical labor organizer, an alcoholic who wanders into town and screams prophecies of economic justice to a world that isn't listening. He is a fanatic soul with no followers, a voice shouting into the void. And quietly observing them all, chronicling their existence in his all-night cafe, is Biff Brannon. He is the proprietor, a man of vague, repressed longings, who struggles with complex feelings about gender and existence. He is not a thinker or a revolutionary, he is a witness, finding his only meaning in watching other broken lives. 4 voices, all desperate, all isolated, and all of them needed someone to talk to. This was the novel's central genius. Carson placed at the center of this storm a silent hub, John Singer. John Singer is a deaf mute. Because he cannot speak, the other characters assume he can understand. They mistake his silence for wisdom. They come to his room one by one and pour out their souls. Mick tells him about her music. Dr. Copeland tells him about justice. Jake Blount tells him about revolution. They are not confessing to him. They are confessing to their idea of him. Singer becomes a mirror, a blank screen, onto which each character can project their deepest hopes, fears, and secrets. He is the perfect savior because he never judges, never interrupts, and never challenges their illusions. But here is the tragic twist and what makes the book a masterpiece. Carson gave John Singer his own mute. Singer, the listener to all, is himself desperately, obsessively devoted to another deaf mute, Spiros Antonopoulos. Unlike the intelligent, sensitive Singer, Antonopoulos is a simple, gluttonous, almost childlike man. But to Singer, Antonopoulos is his God. Singer, too, projects his own longings onto a blank screen. It showed that loneliness is an infinite chain. Everyone is a lonely hunter seeking another heart to latch onto. But that heart is, in turn, busy hunting another. As she neared completion, she found her new title. She read it in a poem by the 19th century Scottish poet Fiona MacLeod, a pseudonym for William Sharp. For the heart is a lonely hunter. It waves and roves. It was perfect. Reeves McCullers played a crucial role in this. He was her first reader. He read every chapter as it came out. Seeing the genius flow from his wife, he set aside his own writing ambitions. He became her support, her biggest cheerleader. It was Reeves who meticulously typed up the final manuscript to send to publishers. It was an act of love, one that would later be poisoned by envy. In 1939, the manuscript reached the editors at Houghton Mifflin, who were stunned by what they read. The reaction was immediate. The publishing house was stunned. They couldn't believe it. How could a 23-year-old sheltered girl from a small Georgia town write with such profound psychological insight? How could she inhabit the minds of an elderly black doctor, an alcoholic vagrant, a cafe owner? They knew they were holding something extraordinary. On June 4th, 1940, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter was published. It wasn't just a book, it was an event. It was not a slow-building success, it was an explosion. Critics searched for the highest superlatives. They called it miraculous and staggering. Time magazine called her the find of the year. The famous poet May Sarton declared, "A genius has appeared." Overnight, 23-year-old Carson McCullers became the biggest literary phenomenon in America. She was the wunderkind. She was compared to Dostoevsky, to Chekhov. Fame arrived like a tidal wave. Money, for the first time in her life, began to pour in. The phone rang constantly. Party invitations, interview requests, letters from admirers. For someone who had spent her entire life feeling invisible, the sudden attention was both intoxicating and terrifying. She was a deep introvert, socially awkward, who had built her entire art on observing from the margins. Now she was thrust into the center of the stage. She and Reeves did what all successful young artists do. They left the South and moved to the center of the universe. They went to New York. But Carson and Reeves didn't just move into a normal Manhattan apartment. They moved into one of the strangest, most chaotic, and brilliant social experiments in American literary history. They moved into 7 Middaugh Street in Brooklyn Heights. It was an old 4-story brownstone overlooking the New York harbor. It was leased by George Davis, the charismatic and influential literary editor of Harper's Bazaar, who had published some of Carson's early work. Davis had the idea to form a sort of unofficial art commune, a boarding house where the most creative minds of the age could live, work, party, and inspire one another. It was dubbed February House, not because it only existed in February, but because so many of its key residents, Carson included, were born in February. And when Carson and Reeves walked through that door in late 1940, they didn't just enter a house, they entered a chaotic ecosystem of genius. It was a house of eccentrics, and every room seemed to contain its own universe. The heart of the house, or at least the man trying to give it an orderly pulse, was W.H. Auden. Perhaps the greatest living poet of the era, Auden took on the role of reluctant den mother. He bustled about trying to impose some order on the chaos. He made schedules for bathroom use, complained incessantly about unflushed toilets, and sternly collected rent, which he grumpily called the filthy lucre. He was the anchor of reason in a sea of brilliance. His frequent companion providing the soundtrack to the chaos was Benjamin Britten, Auden's lover at the time and a brilliant young composer. Britten's piano playing constantly echoed through the halls, his notes intertwined with the unceasing clatter of multiple typewriters, creating a unique symphony of creation. And whose typewriters were they? In one room, it might be Gypsy Rose Lee. Yes, that Gypsy Rose Lee, the world's most famous burlesque stripper. But at February House, she wasn't just an entertainer, she was an intellectual. Gypsy was an incredibly sharp, witty woman and was in the process of writing her best-selling mystery novel, The G-String Murders. Stories tell of her reading chapters aloud to her highbrow housemates, with Auden, in his role as severe critic, offering blunt notes on her plot structure. Adding to the bizarre mix were Paul and Jane Bowles. They were a mysterious writer-composer couple, living out a volatile open marriage. They brought an undercurrent of unpredictable exotic energy, another layer of complexity to the already buzzing atmosphere. And then, at the very center of this whirlwind of intellect and eccentricity, was Carson McCullers. In this collective of dazzling stars, 23-year-old Carson was the queen. She was the wunderkind, the newest prodigy. She wandered the house in her uniform of baggy men's shirts or a favorite romper, smoking constantly and talking obsessively about her characters as if they were real people. Life at February House was a cyclone. By day, it was a creative blast furnace. The sound of typewriters clacked from different rooms. Carson was starting her next work. Gypsy was writing about murder. Britten's piano drifted through the halls. By night, it was a never-ending party. Alcohol, especially cheap sherry, flowed freely. Conversations lasted until 4 a.m., fiery debates about literature, politics, philosophy, and sex. It was an oasis of total freedom, especially as World War II was exploding in Europe. They were a band of exiles, eccentrics, and geniuses who had created their own small world. Carson was the emotional center of the house. She had an uncanny ability to draw people in. They were fascinated by her intelligence, her fragility, and her profound empathy. But there was one person who was being crushed by all of this. That was Reeves McCullers. Imagine being Reeves. A year ago, you were the supportive husband, the one who typed the manuscript for your genius wife. You were her protector and biggest champion. You were also an aspiring writer. Now, you're in New York, but you are not a writer. You are Carson McCullers' husband. While Carson was being celebrated by W.H. Auden, Reeves was being ignored. While Carson was being lauded as a literary prophet, Reeves was struggling to write a sentence. Envy began to eat at him. It wasn't just personal envy, it was professional envy, the most toxic kind. He began to drink more, heavily. He became sullen, argumentative. He couldn't stand living in her shadow. Their marriage, already complex, began to crack seriously under the pressure of fame and the chaos of February House. Carson, caught between her collapsing husband and her glamorous new world, did what she always did when faced with complex emotions. She found an impossible love object. She fell in love desperately, and it was a painful, unrequited love that would shape her next work. The object of her devotion was Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach. Anne-Marie was an almost mythical figure, a Swiss writer, journalist, and photographer. She was devastatingly, androgynously beautiful, often dressing in men's clothes and being mistaken for a beautiful young man. She was the rebellious daughter of one of Switzerland's wealthiest industrialist families. She was a fierce anti-fascist, an adventurer, and a friend of the Mann family, Thomas and Erica. She was also a deeply tormented soul. She was a severe morphine addict and ravaged by depression. To Carson, Anne-Marie was everything. She was the perfect beloved, beautiful, distant, talented, and tragically damaged. Carson, the lover, pursued her with a desperate intensity. She wrote Anne-Marie burning letters, pleading for her love. Anne-Marie, trapped in her own addictions and perhaps frightened by Carson's intensity, kept a kind but firm distance. She could not love Carson back in the way Carson needed. This chaos, a crumbling marriage, a burning, unrequited love, and the pressure to write a follow-up to a masterpiece created a pressure cooker. Carson needed to let it out. So she wrote, and the work that emerged from this furnace was not another heart. It was something dark, compressed, and brutal. It was called Reflections in a Golden Eye. Published in 1941, this short novel was a shock. It was set on a Southern Army base, much like the one Reeves had been stationed at. It was a claustrophobic, morbid tale of repressed desire. There was a repressed gay Army officer, obsessed with a young private, his unfaithful wife who cut off her own nipples with garden shears after a riding accident, a gay Filipino houseboy, and a mysterious young private who enjoyed peeping on the officer's wife at night. It was filled with imagery of impotence, cruelty, and sick longing. It ended in a senseless murder. This was a middle finger to all the critics who wanted another Mick Kelly. This was Carson saying, "You think you know me? You don't know anything." She dedicated the book publicly to Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach. The literary world was horrified. Many readers were disgusted. When Harper's Bazaar serialized it under pressure from George Davis, hundreds of readers canceled their subscriptions, calling it morbid and immoral. Carson had proven she wasn't a one-book wonder. She was a fearless artist, willing to go to the darkest places. But her body, the time bomb from her childhood, was about to collect its debt. The strain of writing 2 major novels, the chaos of February House, the dissolution of her marriage, the agony of unrequited love, and the constant abuse of alcohol and cigarettes, it all came to a head. Around 1941, when she was only 24, she was hit by what was probably her first serious neurological crisis: blinding headaches, blurred vision, weakness down the left side, but doctors still waved it away as nervous exhaustion. But once again, the doctors misdiagnosed it. In a world still foggy on psychosomatic medicine, they looked at her chaotic life, the drinking, the affairs, the dark books, and they called it nervous exhaustion or hysteria. They told her it was fatigue. They told her to rest. She did. Terrified by her body's collapse, she fled. She left Reeves for the first time. She left the brilliant chaos of February House. She ran to the only safety she had left. She went home to her mother. The first, most brilliant phase of Carson McCullers' career had ended in physical collapse. She had survived, but the real battle of her life was just beginning. The return to Columbus, Georgia, was not a victory parade. It was a strategic retreat. Carson McCullers, 24 years old, who had conquered the literary world and lived in the brilliant, chaotic February House, was now back in her childhood bedroom. She had fled the collapse of her marriage and the chaos of New York, but more importantly, she was fleeing the betrayal of her own body. The stroke, though still catastrophically misdiagnosed by doctors as nervous exhaustion, had left its mark. Her left side was weak. Her vision, already poor, now blurred frequently, making reading and writing a challenge. And there was a dull, constant headache, a bone-deep fatigue that never truly went away. She was back in the house of her mother, Marguerite Smith. Marguerite, the woman of iron-willed ambition, who had always believed in her daughter's genius, now assumed a new role: caretaker. Their relationship was immensely complex. It was a deep, undeniable love, but also a gilded cage. Marguerite protected Carson from the world, but also controlled her. She worshipped the artist in her daughter, but treated her like a fragile child. For Carson, it was both a blessing and a suffocation, another version of the very South she had tried to escape. This period was not one of rest. It was a silent war. The outside world saw only a reclusive young writer recovering from exhaustion, but the inner world was a battlefield. Carson was learning to live in a body that had become an enemy. Every day was a negotiation with pain. Illness attacked relentlessly. She suffered from pleurisy, so painful that every breath was an effort. She contracted pneumonia, which nearly killed her several times. Each illness was a reminder of the childhood rheumatic fever that had never truly gone away. The doctors still shook their heads, prescribed sedatives, and advised rest. This medical gaslighting added a layer of psychological torture to her physical pain. She knew something was desperately wrong, but no one would believe her. But while her body was weakening, her mind was sharpening. The inner room, as she called it, could not be quenched. Trapped in her Georgia bedroom, unable to join the New York parties, she turned inward. She needed to write. Writing wasn't a career choice. It was a biological imperative. It was the only way she could process the world, the only way she could bear the silence. She did not return to the dark, morbid territory of reflections. Instead, she turned to a different, more tender, familiar pain, the ache of adolescence. Slowly, painfully, she began a new novel. This one would not be a complex symphony of many characters like Heart. It would be a chamber piece, an intimate trio focused on three lost souls in a southern kitchen during one long, hot summer. She called it The Member of the Wedding. If Heart was the scream of the I into the void, Wedding was the desperate plea for a we. The novel's center is one of her greatest creations, and perhaps the character closest to her own heart, Frankie Adams. Frankie is a 12-year-old girl, awkwardly tall, clumsy, a tomboy. She is trapped in the strange limbo between childhood and adulthood, no longer a child, but not yet a woman. She is brutally, painfully isolated. She doesn't belong anywhere. I have never been a member of anything, she laments. Frankie Adams was Carson. It was her Columbus loneliness, her awkwardness, her burning desire to belong. Frankie's obsession with joining her brother's wedding, her irrational belief that she can go with them on their honeymoon and become part of their we, is a heartbreaking metaphor for Carson's own lifelong search for connection. The other two characters in the kitchen are Frankie's anchors. Berenice Sadie Brown, the black housekeeper, is the voice of reality, wisdom, and lived-in pain. She has been married 4 times and understands the complexities of love and loss. She is the mother, the confessor, and the representative of the stability that Frankie/Carson both craved and resisted. And John Henry West, the small, fragile 6-year-old cousin, he is the innocent observer, another freak whose difference has not yet been named as a curse. He represents the childhood Frankie is losing, a ghostly presence of innocence before the real loneliness sets in. Writing this novel was an arduous process. She was no longer the 23-year-old prodigy writing in a creative fever. She was an invalid in her late 20s. The physical act of typing was an effort. Her hands ached, her vision blurred. There were days she could write only a single sentence, but she persisted. This novel was not a sprint, it was a pilgrimage. She captured something unique, not action, but atmosphere. She wrote about the heat, the heavy, sticky, oppressive heat of a Georgia summer, where time seems to stop, where nothing happens, but everything is felt. She wrote about boredom and waiting and the intense, violent longing for something, anything, to happen. And while she was battling with this novel, a new crucial character entered her orbit, one who would understand her better than anyone, and, in the end, betray her most profoundly. One day, while she was in New York on a brief trip, a young man sought her out. He was 19 or 20, tiny, elfin, with platinum blonde hair and a high, lisping voice. He had not yet published a novel, but was already a legend in the literary underground. His name was Truman Persons, whom the world would soon know as Truman Capote. He had come to her. Carson, then 28, was already a living legend, the author of Heart. He was an acolyte, a boy genius seeking validation from another genius. Their meeting was an immediate, almost mystical recognition. It was a mirror image. They were the Southern Gothic twins. She was tall, awkward, with a deep, slow Georgia drawl. He was tiny, quick, with a high-pitched Alabama lilt. Both were freaks born of the same suffocating Southern culture. Both understood what it was to be different. Both had an inner room where they lived most of their lives. They didn't have to explain their loneliness or their ambition to each other. They just knew. Capote would later describe her as his twin soul. Their initial friendship was one of the great comforts of Carson's life. This wasn't a tortured romance like Anne Marie or a conflicted partnership like Reeves. This was a peer, a colleague, another freak. He read her his early short stories like Miriam, strange, beautiful, disturbing tales. Carson immediately recognized his stature. She looked at this bizarre boy and didn't see the affectations or the voice. She saw pure talent. She said to him the simple, legendary words that Capote would treasure his entire life. "My God, you're a writer." That validation, coming from the author of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, meant more than all the praise he would ever receive. She was his first great champion. For a time, they were a true we, a league of outsiders against the world. This friendship and the grueling work sustained her. She finished The Member of the Wedding. It was published in 1946. It was a massive success, perhaps even greater than Heart. The critics adored it. This time, they weren't shocked. They were moved. They praised her deep understanding of adolescent psychology, her ability to capture subtle in-between emotions. The book solidified her status not just as a prodigy, but as one of the great masters of American literature. Yaddo was, and is, a prestigious artist's retreat in Saratoga Springs, New York. It's a vast estate where artists, writers, and composers are invited to live and work in peace, cared for, and nurtured. For Carson, this was the ideal February house. It had all the intellectual stimulation with none of the self-destructive chaos. It was a place where her genius was taken for granted. And crucially, her physical fragility was understood and accommodated. That success let her re-enter the New York world without surrendering to its chaos. At Yaddo, she deepened her friendship with Capote and added a third soulmate, Tennessee Williams. Williams, the great playwright of The Glass Menagerie and A Streetcar Named Desire, immediately recognized Carson as a kindred spirit. He too was a Southerner, a gay man, an artist tormented by his own demons. He understood her pain, her isolation, and her dark humor. They became a legendary trio, Carson, Truman, and Ten. They were the brightest stars in the American literary sky. They drank together, laughed together, and, most importantly, read each other's work. They were a fortress against the normal world. For a brief moment, Carson seemed to have found a balance. She had critical success. She had a community of peers who understood her. She had learned to manage her frail body. She seemed to have found a safe we. But the time bomb was still ticking. In 1947, she decided to travel to Europe, perhaps to celebrate her success, perhaps to find new inspiration. She went to Paris, the city of light, and it was there that her worst nightmare came true. The massive one, the unmistakable one, the one that could not be explained away, struck. This wasn't a vague weakness or headaches. This was an explosion in her brain. It hit with unimaginable ferocity. Her entire left side, from her shoulder to her foot, was rendered completely paralyzed. She was 30 years old. The news was a shock to the literary world. This was no longer nervous exhaustion or fatigue. The diagnosis was finally brutally clear: the devastating, crippling effects of rheumatic heart disease. The ignored childhood illness had returned to claim everything. Carson McCullers, the genius author who had redefined American loneliness, was flown back to New York on a stretcher. She was no longer a prodigy. She was a severe invalid. She was bound to a wheelchair. The pain was constant. The doctors told her bluntly her career was likely over. Her life, they implied, might not be far behind. The girl who had fled Georgia for freedom was now trapped in a prison more suffocating than any small town. Her own body, everything before, had been a prelude. The real fight for survival and for the work was just beginning. Carson McCullers returned to America not as a literary queen, but as an invalid. The journey back from Paris in 1947 was a long, agonizing flight on a medical stretcher. She was 30 years old, and life as she knew it was over. She was taken to the house in Nyack, New York, a large Victorian home her mother, Marguerite, had purchased with the royalties from her books. This house, overlooking the Hudson River, would become her entire world for the last 20 years of her life. It was both a sanctuary and an elegant prison. The reality of her condition was brutal and irreversible. The childhood rheumatic fever had thoroughly ravaged her heart valves. The massive stroke had occluded a cerebral artery, causing permanent damage. Her entire left side, from shoulder to toe, was completely paralyzed. She could not walk. She was permanently bound to a wheelchair. Perhaps one of the cruelest psychological blows for the artist who had once dreamed of being a concert pianist was that her left hand was now completely useless, drawn up in a spastic claw. She would never play the piano again. Marguerite Smith, the ambitious and controlling mother, now became the full-time caregiver. Their relationship, already complex, became profoundly and suffocatingly intertwined. Marguerite tended to her daughter with an almost fanatical devotion, bathing her, feeding her, and protecting her from the world. But it was also a totalizing control. Carson, the woman who had lived a life of intellectual and social bohemia, was now as dependent on her mother as an infant. The first months in Nyack were dark. The physical pain was unimaginable. She suffered from what doctors call central pain syndrome, a neurological condition where her brain in its confusion constantly sent signals of agonizing pain to her paralyzed side. It was a burning, searing sensation that never, ever stopped. She battled a deep, understandable depression. She contemplated suicide. At 30, it seemed over. The literary world, she was sure, would soon forget her. But in that darkness, a single light appeared from a friend, another Southern freak, who understood both talent and pain. Tennessee Williams, by now at the absolute height of his fame, after the roaring success of A Streetcar Named Desire, came to visit her. He did not come with pity. He came with an idea. Williams had read and adored her latest novel, The Member of the Wedding. He saw in it not just a great story, but something else. He saw the stage. He told Carson, "Honey, this isn't a novel. This is a play." The idea was madness. How could a novel with almost no plot, a book that took place mostly inside the mind of a 12-year-old girl, be adapted for the stage? And more importantly, how could a woman who was severely paralyzed, who could barely sit up, undertake the grueling task of writing a Broadway script? But for Carson, the idea was more than an artistic challenge. It was a lifeline. It was a reason not to die. It was a purpose. And so, in her room in Nyack, the impossible fight began. Carson McCullers decided to turn her novel into a play. She could not use her left hand, so she learned to do everything with her right. She typed the entire script herself, slowly, painfully, with a single finger on her right hand. Imagine it. Every word was an act of will, every sentence a victory over her betraying body. The nerve pain tortured her. Her vision failed. But she persisted day after day, pecking out the words one by one. She faced a huge technical problem: how to stage the rich inner monologues of Frankie Adams In an act of theatrical genius, she had Frankie break the fourth wall, speaking her innermost thoughts, longings, and fears directly to the audience. It was a daring technique for the time, and it worked perfectly. Tennessee Williams acted as her mentor and patron. He read her drafts, offered suggestions on stagecraft, and used his immense influence to convince skeptical Broadway producers to take a chance on this seemingly impossible project. Finally, the script was done. The producers were found. And then came the miracle of casting. They found a 24-year-old virtually unknown actress named Julie Harris to play the 12-year-old Frankie. And as the play's anchor, the housekeeper Berenice, they cast a living legend, the great blues singer and actress Ethel Waters. Rehearsals were fraught. It was a strange play. It had no plot. It was just about feelings, about atmosphere, about three people in a kitchen. Many in the industry predicted it would be a disaster. On January 5th, 1950, The Member of the Wedding opened on Broadway. Carson, frail and terrified, was in attendance in her wheelchair at the back of the theater. What happened next was one of the great triumphs in American theater history. The audience didn't just like it, they were mesmerized by it. Julie Harris's performance as Frankie was hailed as one of the greatest of all time. Ethel Waters' warmth and depth held the entire play together. When the final curtain fell, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then an explosion of thunderous applause. Carson McCullers, the woman whom doctors had said was finished, was the author of the most successful, most acclaimed play of the season. The play won the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best Play, beating out heavy competition. It ran for 501 performances, a massive hit. It made Carson a truly wealthy woman. She had done the impossible. She had beaten death with her art. It was her glittering, public moment of triumph. But parallel to this incredible victory, her deepest personal tragedy was quietly playing out. As news of her theatrical success spread, it reached a man living in self-imposed exile in Europe, Reeves McCullers. Reeves had spent the years since their divorce in a downward spiral. He drank heavily, struggled with his own failed attempts at writing, and was tormented by both envy and a lingering love for Carson. He had heard about her stroke with horror and guilt, and then he heard about the play. The mixture of emotions, pity, jealousy of her new success, and perhaps a genuine desire for redemption, spurred him to action. He began to write her letters full of remorse. He said he still loved her, that he wanted to take care of her. And Carson, despite all the abuse and pain, was still bound to him. Reeves had been her first we. Isolated by her illness, trapped in her wheelchair, she craved companionship, even the dangerous companionship she knew Reeves offered. She was lonely. In a decision that all her friends, especially Tennessee Williams, begged her not to make, Carson agreed. She believed they had both changed, that they could save each other. In 1951, they were remarried. It was a catastrophic mistake from the very beginning. The old dynamic returned instantly, but now it was even more toxic. Reeves was no longer just the envious husband of a successful writer. He was the caregiver to a wealthy invalid. The burden crushed him. He drank more than ever. He became sullen, bitter. His care turned to resentment, and his resentment turned to cruelty. Carson, weak and dependent, was trapped. In 1953, they tried one last gamble. They decided America was the problem. They would move to Paris, where they had, falsely, remembered being happy. They rented a house in Bachevillers, just outside the city. It was not a new beginning. It was an end game. Isolated in the French countryside, with Carson's fragile health and Reeves's escalating alcoholism, the house became a private hell. Reeves was coming completely unglued. He was paranoid and volatile. not physically toward her, but in his own mind. The tragedy climaxed one night in September. Reeves, in a state of supreme drunken despair, entered Carson's bedroom. She was lying in bed, frail and terrified. He wasn't yelling. He was frighteningly calm. He told her that it was over for both of them, that her life was unending pain, and his life was an unbearable failure. And then he made his proposal. He told her he had a large bottle of sleeping pills. He proposed a suicide pact. They would take them together. Carson looked at the man she had loved since she was 20, the man who had typed, "The heart is a lonely hunter." And she didn't see love or release. She saw a killer. She realized with terrifying clarity that this was not a proposal. It was a threat. He was going to kill her, whether she agreed or not. She had to use the only weapon she had left, her intelligence. She acted. She pretended to agree. She told him as calmly as she could, "Yes, Reeves, I think that's a good idea. A wonderful idea, but I'm so tired. Can we do it in the morning?" Reeves, temporarily placated, agreed and went to his own room, presumably to drink himself into a stupor. Carson did not sleep. She waited. As soon as she was sure he was unconscious, she acted, paralyzed, terrified. She dragged herself out of her bed. She crawled to the telephone. She called a friend in Paris, whispering desperately, "He's going to kill me. Get me." The friend drove through the night, arriving at dawn. They carried Carson, still in her nightgown, to the car. She took nothing. She did not look back. She was taken straight to the airport and put on the first flight back to New York. She had fled for her life. She never saw Reeves McCullers again. Carson returned to Nyack safe but deeply traumatized, to the protective and perhaps smug embrace of her mother. Weeks later, the news arrived from Paris. Reeves McCullers had been found dead in his hotel room. After discovering Carson had fled, he had carried out his promise alone. He had taken the entire bottle of pills. The man who was both her greatest love and her greatest destroyer was gone. The central stormy relationship of her life was over. Carson McCullers was now truly alone, trapped in her wheelchair, with the ghosts of the South, of Reeves, and of her own lost body. The return to Nyack this time, after fleeing Reeves in Paris, was a permanent one. Carson McCullers, at 36, entered the final long phase of her life. The house on the Hudson, bought with the glory of the member of the wedding, now became her entire universe. Under the constant and constantly controlling care of her mother Marguerite, she settled into a life defined by two things: unceasing physical pain and an iron will to continue existing as a writer. Her daily reality was a cruel inventory of her losses. She was completely paralyzed on her left side. She moved either by wheelchair or by being carried like a child by her mother or nurses. The central nerve pain from the stroke never abated. It was a constant, fiery burning she had to endure every second of every day. But she refused to surrender. "I must write," she famously declared. "If I do not write, I will not be." And write she did. It is one of the most tragic and resilient images in literary history. Carson McCullers learned to type with a single finger on her right hand. She had a special electric typewriter rigged up on a table beside her wheelchair. And there she embarked on her final ambitious full-length novel, a book she knew might be her last. She called it Clock Without Hands. The novel was a grueling, decade-long struggle. Each page was a feat of endurance. It was a full return to her southern roots, but a South that was changing. Set in the 1950s, it dealt directly with the issue that Hart had only touched upon: the gathering storm of the civil rights movement. The main characters are a small-town pharmacist dying of leukemia and an intelligent and a brilliant, angry young black man determined to confront the town's old racist order. It was a book about time running out for a man, and time-changing for society. It did not have the magical perfection of heart or the tenderness of wedding. The pain, the medication, and the isolation had made her prose, at times heavy, her voice at times preachy. When it was finally published in 1961, critics were respectful but unenthusiastic. They saw the will behind it, but the original flame of genius seemed to have dimmed. For Carson, it didn't matter. She had finished it. She had typed it with one finger. She had proven she was still alive. But while her public battle was with this novel, her private, more painful battle continued. It was the fight against loneliness. Her need to be loved, the lover inside her, had not diminished with illness. It had only grown more desperate. She still fell in love in the way she always had, obsessively, idealistically, and almost always unrequitedly. She developed intense crushes on her caregivers, most notably a young female therapist named Mary Mercer. To Carson, Mary represented health, freedom, and care, everything she had lost. She wrote Mary longing, romantic letters, echoing her tragedy with Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach decades earlier. And once again, the object of her affection could only return friendship and professional compassion, not the passionate love Carson craved. She was a literary giant trapped in a broken body with the vulnerable heart of a teenager. And while Carson was fading in her respectable isolation in Nyack, her twin soul was doing the exact opposite. Truman Capote was at the absolute apex of the universe. He had come a long way from the 19-year-old boy seeking her approval. He had published Other Voices, Other Rooms, a novel many critics immediately, and to his fury, compared to McCullers' brand of Southern Gothic. He had written Breakfast at Tiffany's, and in 1966 he made history with In Cold Blood, becoming the most famous, wealthy, and talked about writer on the planet. In November 1966, he threw his legendary black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel in New York. It was the social event of the century, the party of all time. Everyone who mattered was there, politicians, movie stars, European royalty, and all the beautiful swans he adored. Truman Capote was the undisputed king of New York. Carson McCullers, his twin soul, was not invited. She was in Nyack, 50 years old, weighing little more than 90 pounds, ravaged by her illnesses. The contrast could not have been more painful. The girl who dreamed like Capote was now left behind by the very dream of fame her friend had so ruthlessly captured. But being forgotten was not the final betrayal. The cruelty was. As Capote's fame grew, something inside him turned toxic and bitter. Perhaps it was a deep insecurity, a lingering jealousy of Carson's pure, unadulterated genius. He hated being compared to her. He needed to be the only one, the only Southern Gothic prodigy. To build himself up, he had to tear her down. And he did it publicly and horribly. Capote began to mock Carson in interviews and at cocktail parties. He spread vicious rumors. He even toyed with the cruel suggestion that she had borrowed from him, a claim that doesn't survive even basic chronology, since she was famous before he was. Most cruelly, he mimicked her. He would entertain his social circles by doing an imitation of Carson's voice, a voice that had been severely slurred and damaged by her strokes. He mocked her physical state, calling her looking like a serial killer or a praying mantis. It was a systematic character assassination, a brutal betrayal of the woman who had been his first champion, the one who had looked at him at 19 and said, "My God, you're a writer." Tennessee Williams, their mutual loyal friend, was horrified. He never forgave Capote for the cruelty. Williams understood that Capote, in his own drunken, drug-fueled self-destruction, was attacking Carson because she represented an artistic truth he felt he had traded for celebrity. He attacked her because she was a genius, while he feared he was only a star. Meanwhile, Carson's body was failing completely. After her mother Marguerite died in 1955, a loss that devastated her, her health plummeted. She was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. More surgeries followed. On her hip, on her contracted arm, she endured more small strokes, each one stealing another small piece of her. And yet, she continued. She wrote one final play, The Square Root of Wonderful, a painful autobiographical drama about a broken marriage, a clear attempt to process the tragedy of Reeves. It was produced on Broadway in 1957 and was a critical and commercial disaster. It closed after only 45 performances. This time there was no miracle. She lived her final years in a twilight, cared for by nurses, a shadow of her former self. In August of 1967, the final massive stroke occurred. It was a severe cerebral hemorrhage. Carson McCullers fell into a coma. She lay there, unmoving, in a hospital room in Nyack. She was no longer conscious. She had fought for 35 years against rheumatic fever, against broken hearts, against paralysis and pain. Now the fight was over. After 47 days in a coma, on September 29, 1967, Carson McCullers died. She was 50 years old. The news of her death made the papers, but it was not front-page news. The world was busy with the Vietnam War, the summer of love, the noisy clamor of a new generation. Her death, like her final years, was quiet. Truman Capote, hearing the news, reportedly shrugged. He was still alive, still famous. He had won, or so he thought. He would live another 17 years, only to see his own talent completely replaced by scandal, dying a lonely, dissipated wreck. But Carson was gone. The girl who wrote with her heart had finally had its stop. Her story, it seemed, was over, buried in silence. The death of Carson McCullers, like her life, was quiet. But that silence left a void, a space filled with echoing questions, debates that still resonate today. Her legacy is not just in her books. It's in the tragic what-ifs and complex relationships that defined her. Perhaps the most public and bitter debate centers on the central axis of this story, her parallel relationship with her twin soul, Truman Capote. This was not a simple rivalry between two competitors. It was a betrayal, a one-sided destruction, carried out by Capote against a fallen friend who could not fight back. So why did he do it? Some critics and biographers argue the root lies in Capote's own profound insecurity. When his first novel, Other Voices, Other Rooms, was published in 1948, critics immediately drew comparisons. They called him an heir to, or even an imitator of, the Southern Gothic school Carson had pioneered. For a man of Capote's fragile ego and boundless ambition, being seen as a follower was an intolerable insult. He needed to be the only one. He needed to be the originator. To achieve that, he had to destroy his predecessor. Capote's cruelty wasn't just nasty party banter. It was a systematic campaign. His charge of plagiarism, that she had stolen from him, was a blatant chronologically impossible lie, as Heart was published when he was still an unknown teenager seeking her patronage. But the truth didn't matter as much as the effect of the lie. His most ghoulish act, his imitation of her stroke-slurred voice, wasn't just a bad joke. It was an act of dehumanization. He turned his former confidant from a literary genius into a physical freak, a sickly praying mantis, so that in the public's memory there would be room for only one Southern prodigy, and it would be him. Carson, for the most part, bore this betrayal in silence. She was too ill, too tired to engage in a press war. But her friends, like Tennessee Williams, were outraged. Williams saw Capote's actions as the unforgivable sin, a toxic envy that had crossed all lines of human decency. He understood that Capote attacked Carson precisely because she possessed the one thing he feared he had lost, a pure talent, unadulterated by social ambition. History shows Capote ultimately destroyed himself, dying in lonely disgrace, but the scar he left on Carson's legacy is real, a cruel reminder that, in literature as in love, the lover is often wounded by the beloved. But if Capote's betrayal was a tragedy of public legacy, her private tragedy was more complex. It's the question of Reeves McCullers. It is easy to cast him as the absolute villain, the alcoholic, psychologically abusive, jealous husband who tried to kill his wife. All of that is true, but it is only part of the story. Reeves was also a profound tragedy in his own right. We must remember Reeves was Carson's first reader. He was the one who believed in her genius before the world did, the one who meticulously typed the manuscript, for the heart is a lonely hunter. He had his own literary ambitions, ambitions that were utterly eclipsed and crushed by his wife's meteoric success. He was trapped in the unbearable role of Mr. McCullers, the genius's husband. While Carson was being praised by W.H. Auden and Tennessee Williams, Reeves was an accessory. That professional insecurity combined with his alcoholism, a disease not just a vice, created a toxic brew. His actions were unforgivable, especially the suicide pact proposal. But Reeves was not just a monster. He was a broken man, destroyed by his very proximity to the thing he craved most. Their relationship was a classic example of codependency, a folie à deux, where love and destruction were inextricably bound. His death was the inevitable final chapter of his own tragedy. This chaos in her personal relationships was often seen by critics as fuel for her work, leading to a persistent debate that Carson herself hated, the Southern Gothic label. Like many of her contemporaries, she felt it regionalized and diminished her work. She insisted she did not write about freaks. She wrote about the human heart. And she was right. To call the heart is a lonely hunter. A Southern Gothic novel is like calling Crime and Punishment a St. Petersburg detective story. It's accurate, but it completely misses the point. Carson's characters, John Singer, Frankie Adams, Dr. Copeland, are not sideshow curiosities trotted out for shock value. They are human beings whose universal emotions, loneliness, longing, outrage, are amplified by their isolation. She merely used the setting she knew best, the claustrophobic South, as a laboratory to dissect the human soul. Her obsession wasn't the grotesque, it was connection. She transcended her region to touch a universal truth. She was not a Southern writer. She was a human writer who happened to be from the South. Yet all these debates of psychology, love, and genre must ultimately yield to the largest, most fateful, and most heartbreaking question of all. It is not a debate about art, but about medicine. What if? What if her rheumatic fever at 14 had been correctly diagnosed? What if penicillin, the drug that could have stopped her heart damage, had been available and administered? Her entire life's trajectory would have changed. There is a toxic, romantic myth that great artists must suffer, that it was Carson's pain that fueled her genius. This is patently false. Carson McCullers' genius existed in spite of her pain, not because of it. Remember, her two greatest masterpieces, Heart and Wedding, were both written before the most devastating strokes hit. Her illness did not create her art, it throttled it. It robbed her of 30 years of a career. Instead of 10 or 15 more novels, we have Clock Without Hands, typed with one finger. The pain was not her muse, it was her jailer. The true tragedy of Carson McCullers is not that her heart was broken by love, it's that her heart was physically destroyed by a preventable illness, a failure of 20th century medicine that robbed the world of decades of genius. Why does Carson McCullers still matter? She died nearly 60 years ago in relative silence, eclipsed by noisier contemporaries like Capote and Mailer. She died just before the second wave of feminism could champion her, just before LGBTQ+ studies could celebrate her brave explorations of gender and fluidity. And yet her legacy, like her prose, has quietly endured and is perhaps more relevant today than ever before. Her first legacy is her role as the patron saint of the outcast. Before Carson McCullers, freaks in literature were often props, threats, or jokes. Carson did something revolutionary. She went inside them. She gave them an inner life. She gave us John Singer, Frankie Adams, Dr. Copeland. She said that their pain did not make them lesser, it made them more human. She is the spiritual godmother to every writer of The Outsider, paving the way for explorations of identity, race, and adolescent alienation. It can be argued that without Frankie Adams, we might not have had Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. She legitimized the pain of the outcast and turned it into great art. Her most lasting legacy, perhaps, is her role as the prophet of modern loneliness. She wrote The Heart is a Lonely Hunter in 1940, but she could have been writing it about 2025. We live in the most connected age in human history, with thousands of online friends and followers. Yet studies show we are in an epidemic of loneliness. John Singer, her great central character, is the perfect metaphor for our time. He is a blank screen. People come to him, not to connect with him, but to unload, to project their own needs onto his silence. They talk at him, not with him. John Singer is the metaphor for social media, the Facebook wall, the tweet, the TikTok video we scream into, hoping desperately that someone is truly listening. Carson understood 6 decades ago that the great human tragedy isn't having no one to talk to. It's having no one who truly listens. She understood that connection requires reciprocity, not just projection. Finally, Carson's legacy isn't just literary, it's biographical. She is a monument to the human will. It is the story of the paralyzed woman in a wheelchair who, in agonizing, constant pain, typed out a novel with a single finger. Her life is a terrifying lesson in resilience. While Capote turned his life into a performance art of self-destruction, Carson's life was a performance art of endurance. She refused to be defined by her broken body. She proved that the creative will can be stronger than the disintegration of the cells. While Capote's world was parties, swans, and flashbulbs, Carson's world shrank to a single room, a typewriter, and the absolute will to turn pain into prose. When Carson McCullers died at 50, she was skeletal. Her body, her most faithful enemy, had finally won after a 35-year war. She died in silence, forgotten by much of the literary world, which had moved on to noisier stars. Truman Capote, the soulmate turned tormentor, outlived her by 17 years. He lived to see his talent completely replaced by scandal, dying a lonely, ignominious death, a public tragedy to the very end. So, who won? Capote got the world. He got the fame, the money, and the parties. He lived his life as an explosion. Carson got a room. She got the pain, the silence, and the ghosts. She lived her life as a slow erosion. But Capote died trying to convince the world he was a genius. Carson died simply being one, and that is the final truth. Capote's legacy is a cautionary tale about fame. Carson's legacy is a testament to truth. Truman Capote, in all his cruelty, was right about one thing. Carson wrote with her heart, and for that reason, it was broken early. Her heart was broken by illness, broken by Reeves, broken by Anne-Marie, and broken by his own betrayal. But she took the broken pieces and with one hand in the dark, she built a cathedral. She did not die in silence. She had simply finished speaking. She left the books, and in them she told all the freaks, all the outcasts, all the lonely people of the world, all of us, that she saw us. She made our own loneliness a little more bearable. She turned our pain into art. And in doing so, she made all of us, her lost readers, members of the wedding.